Hello, everyone. This is Ellen Israelson at the Jewish Communal Fund. I want to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to join us today. It is certainly our privilege to help facilitate your philanthropy and to occasionally have the opportunity to bring you some educational information and things that we think might help you with your grant making. At this time of year, I know people feel a lot of pressure to get the grant making done. A lot of charities depend on your support, but we thought it would be extremely helpful to hear from some philanthropy experts about how they approach it and how funders that they work with approach the process of deciding the best and most strategic ways to fund charitable organizations. I'm very pleased to have with us today two terrific experts in philanthropy, Stefanie Rhodes, the Executive Director of the Slingshot organization, who has many years of experience working in Jewish philanthropy, both at the JCF in Manhattan and with the Jewish Funders Network, and Rob Hansen, who is going to tell you a little bit about the whole new world of online philanthropic advising and the myriad of resources that are available online. Rob is the founder of Good Nation, a very innovative new online platform to help with philanthropy. Formerly, he was at Robin Hood, and he's had many years of experience in both fundraising and grant making, and is really going to, I think, provide us with some interesting tools and information. I'd like to kick it off with Stefanie today. Stefanie, can you first give us a little background on Slingshot and explain the process and the selection for the criteria for the Slingshot guide, and in particular, from all of the different charities that have so much to offer, how do you begin this selection process, and what information do you use to determine the organizations that are most effective and are having the greatest impact?
Sure. Thanks, Ellen. Thank you for having me. I put together a little bit, some visuals here to help answer some of those questions that you asked. Just sort of by way of background for those of you who might not be familiar with the Slingshot Guide, we are a resource guide to innovation in the Jewish world. It's an annual guide that's been published since 2005, featuring 50 of the most innovative projects in Jewish life in North America. Over the years, we've focused on particular subjects, or that is women's issues or disabilities, and also in particular geographic locations, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago. The focus has always been on innovation, and one of the things that we do through the publishing of the Slingshot Guide is a Slingshot Fund, which is where the answers to some of those questions and how we approach our grant making comes from. We use this guide as the basis for our grant making. And so I can sort of outline for you in the next slide what our process is and how we think about our grant making. Thank you very much. We several years ago realized that when you're looking at grant making, in our case it was within Jewish innovation, it's really helpful to think about organizations in their life stages, right? Startup organizations are what they sound like. We know what they are, right? It's typically in early stages of development. It's just begun to establish its funding stream, its employee structure, if it has more than one. It's putting together a business model and practices and approaches, and it's highly experimental, and in many cases can be considered even risky, right? By the time we get to mezzanine, we're talking about an organization with a pilot tested idea, documented outcomes, it's got a plan for growth, but it's not fully scaled. They've got a track record of funding, there's lots of people engaged in it, they have a formal board, but it's still in development, but no longer in the startup phase. And then we look at legacy institutions that are marked by much greater brand awareness. It's larger. They have clearly defined management roles. Sometimes they'll even have more sophisticated fundraising programs that have, you know, if we're talking about a legacy institution, we're also talking about an organization that's got much more support than a startup or even a mezzanine. It's something that we think about when we think about how we're impacting the things that we're funding, is where they are in their life cycle, which also helps us think about what kinds of support they might need. So the way that we think about our grant making at Slingshot is really by looking at these 4 criteria: innovation, impact, leadership, and effectiveness. In the creation of the Slingshot Guide, these are the 4 criteria that we use for the organizations that we list in the guide. And as you might imagine, given where organizations are in their life cycle, each one of the metrics for measuring those 4 pillars may differ. And I'll walk you through that next. So innovation, one of the questions that we often get asked is, how do we define innovation? How do we recognize it? What do we mean when we say innovation? So for us, it's really quite simply a mode of operating and finding new ways to create impact, right? They are adapting to the demands in the community or in the world. They are efficient, and they have cutting edge methodologies for achieving positive outcome, right? It is, how this is expressed is relative to where the organizations are in their life cycle. So in startup organizations, it's really, we look at why were they created, what were they looking to solve, are they groundbreaking, inventive, pioneering, and creative in their responses to what's going on in the world. These are like, this is the grassroots, bottom up, really interesting stuff. When we get to mezzanine organizations, we're looking more at organizations that have continued a culture of innovation, right? As they grow, they've continued to find new ways of doing business. And to be clear, I guess it feels important to also say, not every organization always has to be innovative. For us, we use this because innovation is one of our priorities. But we also recognize, this is just sort of like a footnote, that sometimes you get to a point where you've reached where you're supposed to be as an organization, and it's okay not to always be evolving. In our case, though, we are looking at mezzanine organizations that are continuing to evolve. And for legacy institutions who've been around for a while, this is more about the projects that have been born from inside the structure. Are they looking at new opportunities to address the needs in the Jewish community? So if you're looking at a university or you're looking at a Jewish community center, it is a traditional institution, but they might be delivering projects and programs in really new, cutting edge and innovative ways. In terms of impact, it considers how the organization or projects affects the attitudes and behaviors of the community or its constituents that it serves. And again, if you think about the different life stages, if we're looking at impact for a startup, they've really identified a need and they've developed a compelling mission and vision around that need. They are just getting it off the ground, so they may not have even a formal evaluation process in place. And that's, you know, just sort of to flag the impact you might be looking for in terms of the metrics for a startup organization. Really, in our mind, should be different based on where they are in their life cycle, how much staff they might have, the budget that they may have to explore the evaluation and be able to deliver the metrics, and the number of people that they're serving. Where by the time they get to mezzanine, we're really hoping that they're showing proof of concept, that they are really leaning into that theory of change and logic model as a guiding light for their work, and that the evaluation metrics that we're seeing around impact are stronger. And then finally, when we're talking about a legacy institution, certainly there's much more resources to be able to be sure that we're hitting the target goals and measuring and evaluating for impact, and looking at the scalability and viability of the project or program. if we're looking at leadership in the field, so this is not about the CEO or the board chair or the leadership in terms of people. We're really looking at, is this something that can be seen as a leader in the field on the issue that it's addressing? It could have a unique strategy, approach, or program that is replicable in other cities. We love one-off stuff too, but for our grant making and inclusion in the guide, we're really interested in, is this a game changer for the field? Is this able to partner with other organizations, serve as a convener for smaller projects? Is it able to really move the needle in the community at large? And again, just listed, you'll see at the bottom, is how we gauge that based on where they are in their life cycles. So startup organizations have a strong buzz about them. They're leading through their press, what they're writing or what's being written about them. And there's really sort of a sense of a groundswell around the work that they're doing and leading. In mezzanine organizations, they're regarded as having expertise in the field and have started building brand recognition among their peers. You may even notice that there's other organizations adopting some of what they're demonstrating. And then the legacy organizations that are really using their tried and true brand to help elevate some of their more innovative projects. And they are fortunate enough to have formal structures in place to really help elevate some of that work. You know, if you think about a JCC again, as one example, trying an innovative project, certainly within the network of JCCs, let's say, it could potentially be replicable. So this is an important piece too for us. And then we're looking at organizational effectiveness. It's how is the organization and business run? Is it viable? We want to make sure that this isn't something that popped up overnight and will disappear because the effectiveness and structures of the organization are set up for success. So in startup organizations, that often looks like an organization that's got maybe a small staff who can cover quite a bit, that the budget that's there is sufficient enough to cover the operating costs of the organization, and that it can sort of adapt to the changes that happen in a startup as it grows. Mezzanine organizations have more traditional roles in place with governance, that with staff, that they've kind of brought in experts in the various areas. Their budget is growing, their funding base is diversified. And then in terms of the legacy organizations, they have even more formally established board with committees. It's responsible for fundraising, for the health and well-being of the organization, and for for supporting the work of the organization. Is this the last slide that we're on, Ellen? Okay. So Ellen is busy trying to unmute. I hope that I've answered the questions that you've asked. This is really sort of when we think about our grant making and we think about how to support Jewish innovation, I'll just summarize everything that we just went through by saying that we really look at the life stage of the organization, where they are really makes a difference in terms of what we expect to see from them. And I think for us, that's one of the biggest pieces, both thinking about their leadership in those 4 different areas, but also right-sizing our expectations for where they are based on where they are in their life cycle. I think it's really important, particularly around funding Jewish innovation, that there's leeway there for people to grow and experiment.
Thanks, Stefanie. Sorry about that. Rob, I was wondering now, That was a terrific overview, by the way, and it's a lot to digest, but I think it really went to the core of some of the critical pieces that people need to think about as they evaluate their own personal funding strategies. Rob, if you can give us a little background first on Good Nation, and then tell us a little bit about the process you folks use to come up with your issue areas, how you decide which foundations and funders you are going to look to, and tell us a little bit about the process that they use and the type of evaluation so that they can come up with not only their theory of change and short list of charities, but how they make decisions about how they'll continue to support these organizations. And then introduce us to this wonderful world of all kinds of online resources.
Sure. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to Stefanie. That was great. I learned a lot actually about Slingshot. So we're going to try something a little challenging. What you see in that smiley face is you're going to see the map of Good Nation populate, and then I'm going to explain sort of how this all works. So as it's populating, can I direct your eyes to our smiling donor? So that represents you. And I should actually start by saying thank you for taking the time today to listen to this, to try to get smarter in your giving. That's really the first step, is really to have the desire to do better in one's giving. We are real proponents of donors really taking charge, and really donors deciding at a certain point that they want to get organized, they want to get better, they want to learn. And so this today is really part of that. So thanks to JCF for hosting, and Stefanie too for joining. So it really begins for us with this smiley face, the donor. So in our world, we think primarily about the donor and what the donor has to, how a single donor can make a smart decision in a gift or in multiple gifts. The challenge that every donor faces is that there are many, many, many nonprofits out there. So we looked at it recently, and there are 87,000 nonprofits that are have budgets bigger than $500,000. So big enough to do something. And if you're out there as a donor, picking one out of 87,000 is pretty complicated, a pretty tough job. So Good Nation sits in between. So we intermediate and work to organize through our platform and through our services all of those potential nonprofits to be able to present them to donors in an organized way for a donor to be able to choose what matters. And even if we were looking at 87,000, it would be quite difficult. But we're fortunate that the other important player in our space are professional foundations. So you see them at the top. So the idea here is that foundations, you may know of some of them: Bloomberg Philanthropies, Gates Foundation, Schusterman Foundation, Avi High. There's actually, within the Good Nation platform, there's 25 foundations that we work with and whose grant making we're very interested in. And increasingly, we're actually working directly with foundations. We're going to talk about a specific work within the Jewish space just at the end, the last slide, to invite people to participate in the project we're working on. But in the biggest sense, we're really interested in what foundations are funding and why. And so the selection of the green dot and the purple dot and that nice red dot over there, those are organizations that a foundation has said, amongst all the possible in their area of focus, they think those are the strongest. Akin to what Stefanie just walked us through. Slingshot evaluates all of these and then makes some choices. We're interested in those choices. So that little dotted line is actually information coming to Good Nation, and we bring that out to the donor. And Ellen, if you can click forward, what happens next is the donor then can say, I really like that purple dot. I'm going to go with the other dot. And those will be the organizations I select. It's really about trying to make it easy and engaging for donors to be able to find what matters. This is actually the broad array of causes that we cover. So there's 20 causes in front of you, and that's really for us just the start. I'd mentioned the Jewish Philanthropy project we're working on. That is having us actually add a whole set of new causes. Our broad goal is to be able to organize the space such that every donor can find what matters. And as we go forward, we're actually committed to building more causes in response to donor interest. We think that this covers it quite well. And Ellen, actually, to answer your question, we came up with this array of causes by looking first at giving overall, at the biggest sense of where dollars are flowing within the market. And that number is, as you may know, quite large. $410 billion is given annually in the United States. So we began there and started mapping into that. How can we organize those flows and those gifts, and then categorize them and figure them out. Finally, then we looked at, within the professional foundation space, what foundations are doing what work where, and that was our final sort of method to be able to come up with these 20 areas. So we think about this figure quite a bit. The top 10 foundations, professional foundations in the United States of America, spend $1 billion on due diligence, on research, and on oversight. So to be clear, that's not $1 billion flowing out as grants. That is $1 billion in staffing and costs in finding the right great groups, in providing them grants, overseeing them, evaluating them, and then of course, hopefully, renewing or adjusting. So the core idea of Good Nation is to be able to build on that, investment and be able to bring it to all donors. So all the donors here on this call and beyond. And just to focus on this for a second, and Stefanie's example was, what Stefanie walked us through was terrific. She walked us through exactly how they as a funder make their decisions. So I wanted to highlight a few things that, in a slightly more general way, the foundations we follow look at. So all foundations will be looking at what's the overall need addressed, right? They'll look at who's the specific population being helped. What's the plan to do that? Is the plan credible? And the great thing about foundations is that they have a view of all of the players, right? A little tougher for us as donors to be able to get that view. Foundations have it because in a sense they've hired for it, and they spend the time and effort to really get a sense of a landscape before making investments. Finally, does the organization have a track record of success? Impact, outcomes, the very ones that Stefanie talked about, incredibly important. Not just does one have a plan, does one have a project that sounds compelling? Have you done it? When you did, what were the outcomes? And those outcomes are a little difficult because it is really sector by sector, project by project. It is something that is, measurement is something that is very much happening across the professional foundation sector and throughout the nonprofit space. The challenge that we all face is actually wrapping them up and making them meaningful as we talk to donors. So that's a process that we're working on as well, as are many. But know that the best foundations are highly focused on impact and are measuring the impact of their dollars in the best way they can. So we're building on that. What you see on the screen here is a scoring mechanism that Good Nation uses to be able to look at nonprofits. And so the first piece of that scoring has to do with that, the professional foundation investment. So is that nonprofit funded by a professional foundation? And secondly, have they had a renewal? It's great to be funded, to have an active grant, and every nonprofit on our platform and in our services have active grants from top tier foundations, but have they been renewed? And so it's a point system that they actually get credit for. So, and the renewal is really important because we think about it as a form of almost a credit history, right? Because a nonprofit comes to a foundation and says, we would like $100,000 or $200,000 to do X, Y, and Z. It's often much more detailed. And then a year later, those dollars have been spent, but what becomes really important is what happened, what change resulted. And that's reported back. And it's a moment where the foundation has a decision. Do we renew? Do we increase it? Do we decrease it? Or do we decide that this was not successful? So the renewal moment for us is really interesting. The other pieces will make sense. We certainly look at financial health. We're a little wary of ratios that are out there, but we do think about some financial health ratios. So we take a look at that. We look at leadership and score leadership. And finally, we look at governance. And we're actually going to go through an example of that in just a little bit. So to think about some best practices coming out of the foundation space, but really trying to adapt them to what an individual donor can do. The best foundations have very, very clear missions and a clear sense of who they are, a clear sense of their own values and the change they want to see. So what we recommend is for all donors to be really clear about what you care about. and take some time to think about it. We are inundated. Yesterday was Giving Tuesday, and I don't know if your inbox looked like mine, but it was pretty crazy. So there's plenty of people asking, right? You'll get lots of requests. Take the time to say, what matters to me? What matters to us as a family, right? What matters and what's going to matter over time? So that's the first part. The second part is, and linked, is what are your values and how can you live your values in your giving? We do that actually on the platform and in our services. We match donors' values to nonprofits. Everyone can do it. It's just you have to take the time to say, I value hard work. I think that's an incredibly important part. Or I value human dignity. And I'm going to think about that and give as a result of that. Take a moment to think about it. And then the third bullet is really about the next step of it, which is writing a personal mission statement. So all of our donors do that. We encourage them to. Some spend more time on it than others. But putting a pen to paper really helps. We had one donor just recently. Theirs was about treating others as they wanted to be treated. So a very basic idea, but one that's guiding their giving. So we encourage you to take that and to be able to take some time and write it down if you can. Next, I would say, and this has to do with the rush of incoming request, practice saying no. Right? All foundations do it. All donors should do it because you can't fund everything unless you have endless resources, and my assumption is that you don't. So if you can say no, it means that you can say yes in a more meaningful way to the areas that you really want to care about, you really want to see advance. And then of course, you can learn and grow in those areas. And that's my last point, which is really about taking the time to learn about the issue, not just the group. So if you're going to fund in any area, then take a moment to figure out what's happening. So if it's about an educational area, take a moment. Early childhood, there's so much that you can learn. So try not only to focus on the nonprofit itself, but as much as you can about what's happening in that space. And it will just enrich your own experience as you go about doing it. And I have one final little point, which is something that we at Good Nation think about a lot, is to remain humble as we do this. If we do this right, we're partners to leaders in some terrific organizations that are really dedicating their lives and their entire energies to make change. And as funders, we can be partners in that change. And I think being humble is a big part of making that successful and enjoyable on both sides. So happily, online, there are many, many, many resources. And so I'd like to point you to some, and then I'm gonna walk you through actually an example. GuideStar is the biggest. We won't go there, but GuideStar is the one. Oh, we are going there. That's okay. Great. So GuideStar is pretty terrific. So they hold all available public data on 501c3s within the U.S. And so if it's public, you can find it. So, and their main goal is transparency. It's really about, as they say, better decisions. And if we can see the data, we can start to sort of make smarter decisions. I'd caution that a little bit to say that there is what you're looking at. If you're looking at GuideStar data, is you tend to be looking at financial data. And that can be sometimes misleading. I sometimes use the expression with donors that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. What I would use GuideStar is just to see if they're there. You can click through. Having them there is terrific. You can see some budget sizes. You can have some perspective on the organization through GuideStar. Now, I actually prefer to go directly to websites. And more groups are very, very forthright about their work on their websites. And here, of course, you have a nice request as well. They're not shy to ask. But instead of focusing on programs and such, what I tend to think about is leadership and governance. So maybe we could click over to the board of directors and just take a quick look. So the way to think about it is, if you are going to become an investor in an organization, you should have a sense of who's really overseeing it. So that incredibly important board role of oversight, of guidance, of at the strategic level enabling growth, of bringing their own resources. So I always take a look, and now maybe you can scroll down a quick little bit. you sort of see here at Hansen, you have a really interesting array of people. One, it's a good large group of people who are all dedicating, volunteering, right? These are all volunteers who are volunteering their time, they're giving of their own dollars in order to advance this organization. So if you come across an organization, click on the board, and there aren't many people, or the people don't look like they have the combined skills to be able to advance it, where you want to get to is that each board member contributes an important part to advancing an organization. That's how you build an effective board, and a board that can actually grow an organization and help it be all that it could be. So I think this Hansen's a great example of a really strong board. You want to take a look. Next, you want to take a look at the staff leadership. And here, large staff, no question. And Ellen, if you'll just scroll up, this one was interesting because one, you kind of immediately understand that they're pretty democratic. You don't see the leader, first. You sort of get to meet and see all of the staff, which I always find interesting. An array of people who, again, are just this is what they're dedicating their lives to. I'm always inspired when I meet really great nonprofit folks. So you have to go all the way down to be able to find the leader of the organization. Or just about there. And here it is, Nigel Savage. Actually, yep, so if you could scroll back up a little bit. It's a gentleman named Nigel Savage, and you want to just take a look at his bio and experience, or any leader really, and ask yourself, is this someone I think who could lead this kind of organization? And I think there is no doubt, in our opinion, in Good Nation's opinion, that Mr. Savage can and does do that. So, but take that time. It's a different way to think about what's on a website, but it's key. I think without the right leadership in place, without the right governance, no group can be as successful. And we actually sometimes, and all foundations will do this, when there's a leadership change, they definitely take either a pause in their funding, or they will take a serious look at that new leader to make sure that new leader is capable of executing, because it's one of the major components of how organizations are successful or not. Lastly, I would encourage you to take a look at annual reports. So in this case, Hansen is interesting because they provide a monthly report, which is a rich and detailed array of information month by month. And they'll even do, actually, Ellen, if you can scroll a little bit, you can see, for example, they're an events-focused organization. They are entirely public about what they're doing, when, how many people are coming, and totals. And you could dig in. You can go and you can take a look. And you can see exactly who, what, where, when, why. And more and more organizations are doing that, this level of transparency. They find it effective because donors and partners want to know and they want to understand. So take that time. Doesn't take long. What we've done here is taken a few minutes. So as you're giving, look around, click through. And you also get, of course, a good sense of an organization, how it talks about itself and how it exists online is important. We won't do social media, but I definitely encourage you to take a look at social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and that's more about just recent activities, give you a sense of what they're working on in the moment, which is sometimes interesting. So lastly, just wanted to focus on a project we're really excited about. So it's the Jewish Philanthropy Advising Project. And there we're taking everything we've just talked about that Good Nation does and focusing it within Jewish giving. So we're working with 10 amazing Jewish foundations who are helping us select top tier groups. We're organizing them into cause areas and then presenting them for donors. And that work is actually happening as we speak, literally. And so wanted to put an offer out there for everybody. If you want to participate in this, we are happy to have your input and your ideas. And this is sort of how it would work, is that you would have a philanthropic advisor to guide you through the process of finding Jewish charities that match your interests and your values. Once you've given those, you'll receive ongoing updates throughout the year. And there's actually no cost whatsoever to JCF Fundholders. 100% of your giving goes through to your charities of choice. So if you are in need of some help and we can help, and some of these ideas were perhaps interesting or you wanted to pursue, we're happy to do it. And down below, you'll see how you could get involved.
Okay. I'd love to just ask each of you before we turn it over to Q&A. If you just offer one or two key takeaways for people as they march into this giving season. Stefanie, you want to start out? Or Rob, whoever wants to take it.
Oh, I think Stefanie's doing it.
Yeah, I was muted. Thank you very much. So I know, thanks for that, Rob. That was great. I actually was taking notes while you were speaking. So thank you. I learned a lot too. I think I would say, as you think about the impact that you want to have on an organization, we really care a lot about the life cycle, life stage that an organization is in. So I would say, take a look at that and set your expectations accordingly. And I would also say, you know, what do you care about? What's your vision of the world and the impact you want to have? And I would think about, you know, certainly, what's your appetite for risk? Do you have, are you somebody who's got an interest in helping something start that hasn't existed, or do you know, is your interest more in supporting an organization that has deeper roots and maybe a little bit safer? But I think I would sort of, my last thought on this would be that you have to take risk to innovate, to change, to meet the times. And I would encourage everybody to maximize their appetite for taking a little bit of a risk at the end of this year and do something bold that really could help make change in the Jewish community.
Great. Thank you so much, Stefanie. That is really wonderful. Rob, before I ask you to address this, I just wanted to let folks know, if you do have questions, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little Q&A button you can click to type in your questions. That's how we're going to be taking them. And after Rob gives us a couple of points here to think on, we'll be able to start to address your questions. Rob?
Sure. So I think what I would circle back to that idea of values, and but from a slightly different angle. I think that giving is one of those rare opportunities for one individually, or for a couple, for a family, to have some very interesting conversations about, we think about it in terms of values, but about what matters in the world. And that can be, I certainly know that working with lots of families, that can be a very powerful conversation. And sometimes we don't make enough time for those types of conversations, right? What are the most important things for me? And to stop and to really listen to others, to say, well, what matters to you, and how, and then the next important piece of it is how do we make that happen in the world? And as much as we've talked about giving, and that's really one clear way that can happen, don't stop there. You have many skills. You can join boards, you can join committees. There's so many ways. But the first part, I think, is really about clarity on where you want to put your energy, your dollars, all of that. So if you can take some time and really start to drive your own giving, I think that you'll be better off, your family will be, and it will definitely make more impact. And that really is what it's about. It's about trying to make as much change as we can, given the limited resources we have.
Thank you. Thank you both. That was really some incredible advice and a lot to process. I just wanted to let people know that we will be sending out some slides to you, and you will also be able to view the webinar again on the JCF YouTube channel either later today or tomorrow. We'll send out a communique with links for all of that. Couple questions have popped up. We have one here asking, how can we best communicate with organizations to know what they really need?
Great question. Stefanie, you want to tackle it first?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I was muted again. Thank you.
Sure.
Look, I think part of what we do at Slingshot is to try to be in conversation with the organizations that we're supporting and featuring So of the 50 that we feature in the guide, we probably fund about 10 of them. And I would say that we talk to every single one of the 50 in the guide and ones that have applied that haven't gotten in. Which is all to say, I really think that the organizations really appreciate when you ask them, right? Like you can find their information online, reach out. I know there's some trepidation because you're not certain that you'll make the gift and you want to be careful not to set expectations, but I think we're all people in this work, right? So to just sort of have an authentic conversation and say, I'm doing some exploring, there are no promises, but I'm really interested in the work you're doing and I'd like to learn some more. I've never met a development director or executive director who wouldn't welcome the authenticity of just naming where you are and asking to learn more. It's a good opportunity for everyone, even if ultimately you decide not to give a grant. So I would say just ask.
I agree. I second that. And I lived on the other side of that equation for many years. And the reality is that most donors don't. And so it's actually a wonderful and welcome thing to get a call, to get the email, to be able to sort of explain what you're doing and why and how. And so so much of fundraising lived on the nonprofit side is pushing out information and requests and all of that. And so to have that, as Stefanie points out, authentic kind of a dialogue about what you're doing and why and questions, I think it'll be very welcomed. And I do think that development directors and staff and executive directors, they all understand that there's a call doesn't mean a promise, but would welcome the chance to talk, to answer, to be able to tell you more about what you're doing or what they're doing. So don't hesitate. And guaranteed, when you pick up that phone or email, expect people to be responsive and expect them to be interested in talking to you.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. Someone wondering about what tools are there available out there, either online or that you can purchase to help with the values identification process? Are there particular resources that you recommend?
So we actually love the 2164 tools. There's a values card deck. You might find it in a couple of other places too, but the ones actually that we use in our work with NextGen and in identifying the values that help guide some of the grant making that we do with our NextGen is with this values card. So if you went to 2164.net, they have a whole swath of resources and downloadable or purchasable tools that help you navigate some of those questions, and we're huge fans.
We've used them as well here at JCF, and we find them very effective.
I would third that. Terrific group.
Okay. But in addition to 2164, I think if you just Google some of these values identifications, there's a lot out there. And it's particularly great if you're looking to have a conversation with family members, extended family members. Having some kind of structure like the cards or these various tools really works well to get that conversation going. We have another question.
It's actually the first part of our process, so if you did want to participate with us, we're happy to help with that.
Okay. Someone is asking if there is a minimum level of assets or giving level that one needs to be at in order to work with a philanthropic advisor, and also is the Good Nation offer to have people work with a philanthropic advisor? Is there some minimum involved with that in terms of the grant making?
Sure, I can answer that. No minimums. So happy to work with people at all levels, and excited to do so. So the challenge, and that's sort of why we created Good Nation, was that that outside it's a little difficult to get help if you are giving gifts in that. Not in the stratosphere, let's put it that way. So so that's exactly the point and purpose of what we're doing at Good Nation, is to be able to really democratize and open up this knowledge to donors.
Yeah, I would say, because we work with a lot of external, we don't do the internal advising. We work with many external philanthropy advisors, and they exist at many levels. I mean, on the very stratospheric level, we would send people to Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. We work with smaller independent advisors, some who have particular expertise in the Jewish communal world. So if you're interested, we're happy to have a one-on-one conversation here as well. We have another question here. Do most organizations want general support, or are they open to specific projects? What is the minimum amount needed generally to do a specific purpose grant?
So I can speak to this. I would say it is most organizations appreciate general operating support, which gives them a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they spend it. I feel like you set out at the beginning of a year to project your needs and your deliverables, and external factors impact sometimes the scalability in a great way, right? Like you wind up having a greater opportunity in a particular area than you expected, or something doesn't wind up sticking as much with the organizations that or with the target audience that you're trying to affect. And so you see the opportunity maybe more in the periphery than you had expected. And I think it gives you more flexibility. So most of the organizations that we work with, their ideal would be core operating support. That said, around the question of the minimum for a particular project, I've seen projects that were $1,000 and projects that were many millions of dollars. And I would say this is where that conversation with the organization around what their needs are might really serve you and them well. If you're more inclined towards a targeted gift, either to say, I'm interested in a particular piece of your work, and, what would you be able to do with a gift of X size? Or, I really want to help you move the needle on an issue. What would you need to be able to make that happen? So I would just say, again, to go back to this conversation with the folks at the organization to figure out what their needs are and how you might align your interests, your capacity, and their goals and mission and vision for that year.
Yep. I guess to that I would add that and echo that the preference, if you're sitting on the nonprofit side, is always to receive dollars that can be applied in ways that you as a leader of an organization best match and meet the mission and purpose and programs that are required. And as Stefanie points out, that is changeable over time. I think sometimes we think about general operating funds as being somehow inert in an organization, or paying for things that aren't important, or in some way not effective. But we don't see it that way. We think that if you're backing an organization that has a strong plan and has the right people in place to execute on that plan, to some degree, you're limiting their ability by putting a restriction on it. Now, that said, there are definitely times when we think that it makes sense to do that designated grant. And what we often run into is big organizations that are doing many things, and you're interested in only one part of it. And so adding that restriction to say, I'm really interested in only this one important piece of your work, and I want to advance that. So we think that there's definitely time and instances, but we always like to think about it as the second choice, not the first choice.
Right.
Amount too, I think it is, Stefanie's right, it depends on every organization. One thing to think about, and we think about it as in our role as a grantor, is how much burden are we placing on our on grantees, and is that amount enough for them to be able to track and do all of that extra work? And it's going to be different for every organization, but that conversation is important, and we want to respect the time of organizations and how much work they have to do based on the dollars they're receiving, aside from doing the important work they're actually doing, right? So great question though.
Rob, I would actually just, thank you, even say to that point that restricting a gift comes with, baked into that is a little bit more work in terms of tracking it over time and release, depending on how your financials are set up and when and how you can release those funds if they're set aside for a particular project, which is only to say, You might also want to think about right-sizing your gift. If you're targeting it, know that some of the staff time is going to be used to track the funds to make sure that they're used precisely the way that you say they must be used. And just sort of think about, you want to make sure that the gift isn't so small that essentially what you're paying for is the tracking of the gift, right? Like, you want to just be mindful of that.
That's an excellent point. I don't think people always take into account the work and expense of the tracking and evaluation. Just the other thing I throw in there is to make sure you've had a really thorough conversation with the grantee organization about how you both see the outcomes. Because the other place I've seen some of these program-specific or restricted gifts go wrong is when there was not a really thorough conversation between the funder and the grantee about what outcomes they were looking for, what benchmarks were in place, and how they were looking to check and see if they achieved these, and did they build in a communication process so as they went forward there was some ability to have a conversation about what was going on, as opposed to all of a sudden reporting back to the funder that XYZ was not accomplished, as opposed to having that ongoing dialogue.
I think that's right. Actually, I'm working with a family that's living that right now, and it was a 3-part gift, or sort of a 3-year pledge, and they're into they'd be going to the 3rd year of it, and there wasn't that level of communication about what was happening and adjustments, and there are some surprises that we're having to work through. So agreed, having that it's almost a requirement, having that line of communication open, and being ready to accept adjustments and think about the fact that it doesn't always, no plan is ever executed exactly as it sits on paper.
Okay. We have time for one last question here. Someone is asking if, in your experience, it's useful to make, I guess, a smaller introductory grant initially to get to know the organization with the possibility of increasing funding later. Is this a way people approach their grant making?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's a great idea. I think there's no better way to understand whether that organization is going to be one that is going to be meaningful to you in a deeper sense. And so, for sure, I mean, it's I guess for us, we think about the renewal idea. It would be just that, is that first grant would be, you would take a look at it and think about what happened as a result, and is that something that was, was the kind of change you wanted to see, or you can give a full sort of evaluation before you take that big leap. And I think that is a much smarter way to go than going for the leap. I think hopefully we're thinking about these as longer term relationships. And so the total amount over time will likely not be different. So taking the time to give that initial grant, learn, see the results, and give a bigger one, terrific way to proceed, I think.
Sure. And the only thing I would add on top of that is just to set realistic and reasonable expectations for what you're hoping to see, so that you're helping to set up the organization for success. And so that those metrics can be met to help deepen the relationship between you and your family and the organization that you're supporting. If in fact you decide to go that way, like, what are you looking to see? What will meet your expectations at the end of the year, and pave the way for renewal?
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Stefanie. That was wonderfully informative. And we thank you for sharing your time. I know this is a hectic time of the year for anyone and not for profit, but this was really terrific. And thank you to all our donors who joined us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy giving season.
Happy giving season.